Hey, this is the first video for the Things They Carried unit, and this one's all about Tim O'Brien, our author. So let's get going. Our lesson objective for this unit is students will be able to list key information about Tim O'Brien, his book, The Things They Carried, and postmodern literature. So your first question in your Cornell notes is, where is Tim O'Brien from? Well, this is our homeboy. He is from Minnesota. It's not often that we read literature written by someone from Minnesota. The Great Gatsby is another one, right? F. Scott Fitzgerald was from Minnesota. But here is one where the author is from our neck of the woods. Maybe not exactly our neck of the woods, same state. He's from Worthington, Minnesota. I guess he was born in Austin, which is not far from Worthington, both small towns. And he was born in 1946. He grew up in Worthington. The turkey capital of the world is what it's known for. I think they also have a Campbell's soup manufacturing there. But it's a small, teeny tiny little town that influenced a lot of who he was, especially who he became, but especially who he was when the Vietnam War broke out, which is central to this text. He, after growing up in Worthington, the small town, went to Macalester College, and he did very well there. He was, first of all, graduated valedictorian from Worthington, but then when he went to Macalester, he became student body president there. He also graduated with highest honors. That's what summa cum laude means. And he earned a full ride for a graduate program at Harvard University. And it was a journalist program. He was interested in journalism and political science at the time. And he was positioned after graduation, he graduated in the summer of 1968, to attend Harvard, payment free on this full ride scholarship. But something else happened. He was drafted into the Army in 1968. And so this was the summer before he was supposed to attend graduate school. And he did end up serving that one tour of duty for 12 months in Vietnam. And even though he was opposed to the war and didn't want to serve, he still decided to serve. He describes this as the most difficult summer of his life. And the summer where he started to really use typing, pounding out on the typewriter is what he said he spent that summer doing. And so it's when he used writing to deal with some of his angst, and it probably helped him become the writer that he is now. Here's a picture of Tim O'Brien in Vietnam in 1968. You can find this one easily on the internet, but it's authentic. That's the guy. A couple more here. So he served in Vietnam War. He also wrote 8 books that are about the Vietnam War in some way, shape, or form. The one we will be reading, The Things They Carried, is centrally focused on the Vietnam War. Some of his other books are just dealing with Vietnam in tangential ways, but they do all include the Vietnam War. He considers it the central event in his life, and so he can't really escape it, is how he describes it. When he returned from the war, he did write a memoir, a nonfiction autobiographical piece about his tour of duty. And he published that as If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home. This was his only nonfiction piece about the war. So even though he studied journalism, which is nonfiction, he turned after his memoir to fiction. So he did go ahead and go to that Harvard graduate program and studied journalism there. So they gave him an extension, and he was able to still do that after serving his tour of duty. And he wrote for the Washington Post. So he did become a journalist for a short amount of time. But the way that O'Brien describes it, he says that he couldn't get the stories out of his head, and they kept coming back to him, and eventually he starts writing them. First with the memoir, and then later with novels. He won the National Book Award for his novel Going After Cacciato in 1979, and this is one that we have here at Cooper and that has been taught in the past. I've taught this one as well. The Things They Carried was not published until 1990, and he didn't write it until then either. So it was more than 20 years after he served in the Vietnam War. And so in a lot of ways, the book is about memories and imagination tying in with memories from that vantage point, that distance of 20 years. He wrote 5 more books after The Things They Carried, and here they are. He hasn't written anything in the last 17 years. July is his most recent book. And there's actually a documentary about Tim O'Brien that came out right before COVID, I think in 2019, about kind of his writer's block and where he's at right now in his life. And so that's something you might want to check out if you are interested in this guy. Okay, here is an important question. Is Tim O'Brien a character in The Things They Carried? It's a tricky one. There is a character named Tim O'Brien in The Things They Carried. This character was born in 1946, grew up in Worthington, Minnesota, attended Macalester College, served a tour of duty in Vietnam in 1968, returned and went to Harvard, and then worked for the Washington Post, and then wrote a book, Going After Cacciato, from which the character quotes. However, Tim O'Brien, the author, is not the same as this Tim O'Brien, the character, whom I've just described. What the heck does that mean, you're asking me? Well, Tim O'Brien, the author, the real guy, wrote a book with a version of himself as a fictional character. And we'll be talking about this a lot. The key here is that he is trying to blur the line between fiction and nonfiction, which is a very postmodernist thing to do. The next video is going to be about postmodernism. In a lot of ways, O'Brien is tricking the reader into thinking the book is nonfiction, even though it is fiction. We know that Tim O'Brien, the character in the book, is not Tim O'Brien, the author, because Tim O'Brien, the author, has said so. He said he has some major differences between the character in the book, including the fact that he didn't have a daughter. He still doesn't have a daughter. But in 1990, when the book was published, he had no children. Another major difference between the character and the author is that the character decides to leave Worthington for the Canadian border when he learns that he's drafted into the war. He's considering draft dodging. Dodging the draft. I'm sorry, I can't quite get that term right this morning. And he says that the real Tim O'Brien didn't ever do that. He sure thought about it, but he didn't actually get in the car and drive. So O'Brien, the author, is creating a character that is a version of himself, but it's not himself. And that is an important distinction to make. So, as I said, he tricks the reader into thinking it's nonfiction, even though on the title page, O'Brien tells us that it is a work of fiction. And that is something we have to remember. It is not nonfiction. It is not memoir. It is fiction. It is a novel, in fact. O'Brien tricks us into thinking that it's nonfiction in a lot of different ways. The first way is on the dedication page, which is a couple of pages after the title page. In the dedication page, O'Brien dedicates the book to the men of Alpha Company, and in particular to Jimmy Cross, Norman Bowker, Rat Kiley, Mitchell Sanders, Henry Dobbins, and Kiowa. These, as you start reading the book, you'll find out are the characters in the book. And so he is not dedicating the book to real people, as it may seem before you've read the book, but rather to fictionalized characters that he has created. The second trick comes on the next couple of pages. After the acknowledgments, after the contents, we have an epigraph. An epigraph is simply a short inscription in the beginning of a book from a different text. And this one comes from John Ransom's Andersonville Diary. And in it, John Ransom seems to be describing the book you're about to read, calling it a book about the late war, and saying that you'll see that it's very truthful. So it seems to be that this is from another author stating that the book you're about to read is true and factual, is real. However, when you look up John Ransom's Andersonville Diary, you will find out that it was actually published in 1881, more than 100 years before the book, The Things They Carried, was published. And it's written by a POW, a prisoner of war in the Civil War, about his time in 1863 in the Confederate prison of war system. So it has nothing to do with The Things They Carried. And that's another way that O'Brian tricks us. Keep watching for these tricks and keep thinking about, why would someone do this? Why is he blurring the line between fiction and nonfiction? I hope you enjoy the first reading.